little girl stopped in her tracks when she saw a German shepherd mother and pup tied up, snow covering their backs, and the rescue story that followed became the most beautiful moment of that winter. Before we continue, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The Carter family's small home in Oak Haven, Montana, was quiet except for the hum of the old space heater. Outside, the wind rattled bare branches against the window pane, the sky already heavy with snow though it was barely past noon. Inside, 10-year-old Wendy sat cross-legged on the rug, half focused on her homework until the television newscaster's tone sharpened and pulled her eyes to the screen. "This just in," the anchor said, his voice flat with urgency. "County law enforcement has issued an emergency apprehension order for a German shepherd named Tana, a former K-9 unit dog. Tana is accused of inflicting serious injuries on her handler and is now on the run with her puppy. Authorities warn she is extremely dangerous." An official photo of Tana filled the screen. Alert ears, sable coat, deep amber eyes. The caption, "Aggressive K-9 on the loose," burned across the bottom. Wendy stared at those eyes and didn't see aggression. She saw something else. Fear, confusion, maybe even pain. And deep in her gut, something told her the story they were selling wasn't the truth. Her mom muted the TV, muttering about dangerous animals, but Wendy hardly heard. She kept replaying that photo in her mind as she tugged on her boots after school the next day, cutting across the snowy woods instead of taking the long way home. The forest was quiet in the way winter woods can be. Every sound muffled by snow, every shadow sharper in the dim light. Halfway down a narrow deer trail, Wendy froze. Not the high, sharp bark she'd expected after last night's warnings, but a low, rolling growl slid through the air. Her pulse kicked up, but curiosity rooted her feet. The sound came again, from behind an old tool shed that had been collapsing into the underbrush for years. She stepped carefully, boots crunching in the packed snow, and then she saw her. Tana lay against the shed wall, her right hind leg drawn tight, a fresh tear in the fur where blood had matted it. Her coat was dulled with dirt, her body curved around a small shivering pup tucked into her belly. The growl deepened as Wendy's shadow fell across them, but the dog didn't lunge. She stayed between the girl and her pup, head low, eyes locked. Wendy's heart thudded. She knew any quick move might make things worse. So she crouched slowly, the way her uncle had taught her to approach a skittish horse, and met Tana's gaze. "I'm not here to hurt you," she whispered, her breath fogging in the cold. "You're not the monster they say." The puppy stirred, letting out a tiny whimper. Tana's ears flicked toward it, then back to Wendy. The growl softened to something more like a warning hum, but it didn't stop. Somewhere in the distance a siren wailed, growing louder. Wendy glanced over her shoulder as red and blue lights danced through the trees. A county SUV crunched to a stop at the edge of the clearing, and Deputy Ethan Cole stepped out, his boots sinking into the snow. Ethan was in his late 30s, lean from years of patrol work, with eyes that had seen enough to know every story had two sides. He'd heard the dispatch. Possible sighting of the dangerous dog. He'd expected to find an animal ready to attack, not this. A wounded shepherd guarding a pup, and a girl kneeling a few feet away. "Wendy," he called, his voice steady but edged with warning. "Step back, slowly. That dog could hurt you." "She won't," Wendy said without looking away from Tana. "She's scared, not mean. Look at her." Ethan took a few careful steps closer, reading the tension in Tana's body, the way her weight shifted to keep herself between them and the pup. His training told him to call in animal control, keep his distance, but his instincts, those same instincts that had kept him alive more than once, told him something didn't fit the narrative. He lowered his voice. "All right, but you keep still." Snowflakes drifted between them as he spoke in the low, calm tone he used with nervous strays. Tana's growl faded to a rough pant. Her eyes stayed wary, but there was no snap in them, no wild edge, just a dog holding her ground. Ethan glanced at the pup, then back to Wendy. "We're gonna need to move her, but no sudden moves, let me try." Wendy nodded, shifting just enough to give him room. Ethan crouched, keeping his profile small, and let Tana take in his scent. She flinched when his hand moved, but didn't bare her teeth. Inch by inch, the air between them changed, from a standoff to something tentative, fragile. Behind them, the wind picked up, and the scent of snow and pine swirled through the clearing. Out on the road, the siren wound down to silence. For the first time since the broadcast, Tana's ears eased back, just slightly, and her eyes flicked from Ethan to Wendy. In the middle of a Montana winter, with the county hunting her as a threat, a former K-9 and a stubborn little girl were making the first fragile stitch in a bond no one else believed in. By the next morning, the story had already made its rounds in Oak Haven. The sheriff's office issued another statement warning residents to report sightings of the dangerous shepherd immediately. The words "dangerous shepherd" curled in Wendy's stomach like sour milk. She sat at the kitchen table, stirring her cereal long after it had gone soggy, listening to her mom and a neighbor speculate about that K-9 gone rogue. Across town, Deputy Ethan Cole wasn't buying it either. He'd spent half the night in the small outbuilding behind his cabin, where Tana and her pup, now dubbed Rory by a grinning Wendy, rested on blankets in a large kennel he'd set up. The dog's leg wound had crusted over but was far from clean, and every time she shifted, Ethan could hear the faint hitch in her breathing. By mid-morning, he decided they needed more than his first aid kit. He called someone who knew more about dogs than anyone in the county, Dr. Helen Vance, a retired veterinarian whose specialty had once been working dogs for the military. Helen's clinic sat at the end of a gravel lane. The old sign faded, but still legible. Vance Veterinary Services. She opened the door before Ethan could knock, wiping her hands on a faded denim apron. Her hair was more silver than brown now, her limp pronounced in the cold, but her eyes were still sharp. "Bring her in," she said without ceremony. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and hay from the barn out back. Wendy trailed close behind Ethan, carrying Rory in her arms. Tana followed, stiff-legged, her eyes sweeping the room, every muscle taut. "She's not just spooked," Helen murmured, circling to Tana's left side. "She's assessing exits. That's trained behavior." While Ethan steadied her, Helen's fingers moved gently through the fur along Tana's neck. "There," she said, parting the coat to reveal a patch where the hair was clipped shorter than the rest. Beneath it was a faint alphanumeric tattoo, nearly hidden in the skin's folds. "That's a K-9 registry code," Helen explained. "But it's old, and here—" She shifted her touch slightly, frowning. "This isn't standard. Someone's embedded a secondary microchip." Ethan blinked. "2 chips? Not regulation," Helen said flatly. "And this one's not in the public K-9 database. I'd bet good money it was put there off the books, which means somebody didn't want her traceable through official channels." She moved down Tana's body, noting the fresh leg injury, the scar tissue around her ribs, and faint abrasions along her shoulders. "These," Helen tapped lightly, "are from blunt force. She's been struck more than once with something like a baton. This dog wasn't just abandoned, she was abused." Wendy's hand tightened around Rory. "But the news said she attacked her handler." Helen straightened, meeting Ethan's eyes. "Maybe she did, but I doubt it was unprovoked." As if on cue, Ethan's phone buzzed. An unlisted number. He stepped aside to answer. A low voice came through the line, distorted just enough to prickle the hair on the back of his neck. Fisher isn't her real handler. Check the records from 6 months ago and be careful who you trust. The line went dead before Ethan could speak. He slid the phone back into his pocket, the name Jack Fisher rolling in his mind, the man listed in the incident report as Tana's injured handler. Before he could process it, Helen's gaze cut past him toward the front window. Ethan? Out by the road, half hidden in the shadow of a leafless oak, sat a green pickup truck. The driver leaned forward slightly, just enough for the brim of a worn cap to catch the light. Even at that distance, there was something in his posture, coiled, watchful, that put Ethan on alert. Tana saw him too. Her ears went rigid, her body snapping upright as a deep growl rolled out of her chest, louder than anything Wendy had heard from her yet. The hair along her spine lifted, eyes locked on the figure in the truck. The man didn't linger. He started the engine, tires spitting gravel as he eased away, never turning his head toward the clinic. "That the same truck you saw near the shed?" Helen asked. "Yeah," Ethan said, jaw tight. "And that's no coincidence." Tana's growl faded, but her gaze stayed fixed on the door as if she expected him to return. Helen wiped her hands. Whatever's going on, she knows him, and she's not afraid. She's angry. Ethan thought about the broadcast, about the cut-and-dry story the sheriff's office was pushing. Then he thought about the hidden microchip, the bruising, the man in the truck. Too many pieces didn't fit. He crouched beside Tana, meeting those amber eyes. "We'll figure this out," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Wendy knelt beside him, her small fingers brushing Rory's ear. "She's not the villain, is she?" "No," Ethan said, standing. "But if we want anyone else to believe that, we're going to need proof." As they left, the snow began again. Slow at first, then heavier, muting the world in white. Somewhere beyond the falling curtain, the green truck was out there, circling, watching. And Ethan knew they'd just taken the first step into a fight that would be far messier than any arrest he'd made in his career. Because this time, the one accused wasn't the only one being hunted. The snow in Oak Haven had settled into deep, wind-carved drifts, muting the sharp edges of town life. Out at Ethan's cabin, the world felt even more remote. Pine trees bowing under white weight, the road in and out reduced to a pair of narrow tire tracks. It was the kind of isolation that could make you feel safe, or watched. For Tana, it was both. Ethan had set up a bed for her in the corner of his mudroom, thick blankets layered for warmth. Rory stayed curled against her most of the time, a warm, breathing reminder of what she was protecting. Wendy came by every afternoon after school, trudging the half-mile through the snow with a determination that seemed to melt some of Tana's frost each day. At first, the shepherd tolerated Wendy's presence without acknowledgement. She would keep one eye half open, her breathing slow and measured, as the girl sat cross-legged nearby, reading out loud or quietly humming. But over the week that followed, something shifted. Tana began watching her more openly. One afternoon, as Wendy read from a worn library book, Tana rested her chin on her front paws, her gaze fixed, not on the door, not on Ethan, but on the girl's face. "You can come closer," Wendy whispered one day, holding out her hand. She didn't expect a response, but Tana's ears flicked forward, and after a long moment she inched closer. When her nose touched Wendy's fingertips, the girl felt the warm puff of her breath. No growl, no retreat. By the end of the week, Tana allowed Wendy to stroke the fur along her neck. 2 days later, she did something that stopped Ethan cold. She left Rory in Wendy's lap and lay down beside them both. It was trust, cautious, fragile, but real. That trust was what Ethan leaned on when he decided to test something. In the back of a locked drawer in his desk, he kept a file folder of old photographs from law enforcement bulletins. Some were tied to known smugglers and animal traffickers he'd come across in his career. He waited until Wendy was there, partly because he knew Tana might feel safer, partly because he'd seen her react differently when Wendy was in the room. He slid one photo onto the rug in front of Tana. It showed Jack Fisher in uniform standing beside a younger man Ethan didn't recognize. Tana glanced at it and looked away, no reaction. Then Ethan added a second photo, the same younger man, but closer up, the image grainier. A pale scar cut down the man's chin like a lightning bolt. The reaction was instant. Tana stiffened, muscles coiled, ears locked forward. A growl started deep in her chest, low but unmistakable. Her eyes burned into the image as if it might move. "She knows him," Wendy said softly. Ethan swapped the photo for another. Fisher and the scarred man together. No uniforms. Standing in front of a building Ethan recognized as a private training facility 2 counties over. This time, Tana barked. Short, sharp, urgent, before pacing in a tight circle. Ethan tucked the photos back into the folder. "That's what I needed to see," he said, more to himself than to either of them. The next step was corroboration. He drove out to the far edge of town to see Agnes McCall, a wiry, sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who'd lived on the same patch of land longer than Ethan had been alive. She met him on her porch, bundled in a wool sweater, her gaze flicking to the truck before settling on him. "You're not here for coffee," she said, motioning him inside. Ethan laid the photos on her kitchen table. "Recognize either of these men?" Agnes didn't hesitate. "That one," she tapped the scarred man, "was here a few months back, had that shepherd with him. Same markings as yours. She didn't want to go with them. Kept pulling back on the chain, then she lunged, snapped at him hard. He hit her with the flat of his hand right across the muzzle. I almost called you then." "And the other man?" Ethan asked. "Came by later, driving a different truck. Didn't say much. But the way they handled that dog..." Agnes shook her head. "That wasn't training. That was control." Ethan left with the confirmation he'd been hoping for, and the sick knowledge that whatever Tana had done to end up on the county's dangerous list had probably been her trying to defend herself. That evening, the 3 of them, Ethan, Wendy, and Helen, sat around Ethan's kitchen table, the folder of photos and Agnes's statement between them. Tana lay by the back door, Rory curled into her side. Helen leaned back, arms crossed. "You've got eyewitness testimony tying her to these men, injuries consistent with abuse, and a hidden chip. But until you can prove they planted Fisher as her handler, it's your word against theirs." Ethan rubbed his temple. "Then we find proof. Records, transfers, anything." Wendy, quiet until now, glanced toward Tana. "We can't just let them take her back." "They won't," Ethan said. "Not if I can help it." Helen's voice softened. "You're taking a risk, Ethan. If the wrong people figure out you're keeping her, you'll have more than just a green pickup circling." He knew she was right. But as he watched Tana lift her head to rest her muzzle on Wendy's knee, he felt the decision settle like a stone in his chest. He wasn't going to turn her in, not until the truth was on paper. Later that night, long after Wendy had gone home, Ethan sat at his desk with the old laptop he used for work no one needed to see. He dug into property records for the training facility in the photo, cross-referencing names with business licenses. It took hours, but there it was. A shell company tied to both Fisher and a man with the same last name as the scarred stranger, Caleb Knox. He closed the laptop, the pieces clicking into place. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Ethan froze, listening, but it was only the wind shifting the eaves. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered as he turned out the light. Out in the mudroom, Tana's eyes reflected the faint glow from the porch light. She didn't sleep. She was listening, the same way he was. And somewhere, Knox and Fisher were still out there, likely already planning how to reclaim what they thought belonged to them. What they didn't know was that Tana had already chosen a side. The wind had shifted by late afternoon, carrying the metallic bite of an oncoming storm. Oak Haven's streets emptied earlier than usual, shopkeepers pulling down awnings and locking doors as clouds thickened into an unbroken slab of gray. Out at Ethan's cabin, the air was tense in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Helen had just left after a hushed conversation with Ethan at the kitchen table, her limp more pronounced as she made her way down the icy steps. Wendy sat cross-legged on the rug beside Tana, braiding a bit of twine into a makeshift collar for Rory. Tana's amber eyes tracked every movement Ethan made, her ears flicking at the smallest sound. She knew something was different tonight. Ethan moved between the counter and the table, laying out items with military precision. Flashlight, radio, spare magazine, zip ties. The plan was already in motion. A call earlier from an old state contact had confirmed what he'd suspected for weeks. Fisher and Caleb Knox were running more than just stolen K9s. They were moving narcotics in and out of a warehouse on the outskirts of town, using the dogs both as guard animals and as cover for transport. "Wendy," Ethan said, his voice even. "Helen's coming back for you in an hour. You'll stay with her until I'm done." The girl looked up sharply. "I can help." "Not tonight." Her eyes darted toward Tana. "She'll be with you?" "She'll be leading me." Tana tilted her head at the sound of his voice, as if she understood. In a way, Ethan believed she did. By the time darkness settled over Oak Haven, the storm had become a steady curtain of snow. The special response unit from the state was already staged half a mile from the target, their black vehicles blending into the tree line. Captain Renee Foster stood by the hood of her SUV, her breath fogging in the cold, outlining the final sweep of the plan. "Cole, you and the dog are point," she said. "You get us inside without spooking them. Once we're in, containment seals the exits." "Understood." Tana padded silently at Ethan's side, her posture taut but controlled. The snow muffled their approach as they moved along the perimeter fence. Through gaps in the siding, Ethan could see the glow of yellow light spilling across a concrete floor, shadows pacing in the cage rows. The stench of unwashed fur and ammonia leaked into the cold air. Tana's head snapped left. Her body stiffened, ears rigid. She angled toward a side door, one Ethan hadn't planned to use. He hesitated, then trusted her. At his signal, a breacher moved forward, the lock giving way with a muted pop. Inside, the noise was immediate. Claws scraping metal, muffled whines, the low growl of a Rottweiler in the far cage. Ethan scanned quickly. At least a dozen dogs lined the walls, some standing, some too weak to lift their heads. "Clear these first," he told two officers moving deeper with Tana. She ignored the open cages, nose working furiously until she reached the back wall, a sheet of corrugated metal with a single, heavy door. She pawed at it once, then stepped back, eyes on Ethan. "Got something," he called. The hydraulic spreader popped the padlock, the door swinging open onto a narrow hallway that stank of mildew and fear. At the end was another locked door. The breacher moved again. When it opened, the air inside was thick and stifling. 4 small German shepherd puppies huddled in a crate, their fur patchy, eyes wide. An empty water bowl sat beside them, the metal rim crusted with ice. Tana moved to the crate, lowering her head to sniff each pup. Her tail lifted slightly, not wagging, but purposeful, as if counting them. "They're alive," Ethan said into his radio. "4 more." The next shout came from the far side of the warehouse. "Movement! East exit!" Ethan turned just as a figure burst from a side door, snow spraying under his boots. The light from the loading bay caught the jagged scar on his chin. Caleb Knox. Behind him, another figure emerged. Fisher. "Don't move," Renee's voice cracked through the night, followed by the snap of safeties clicking off. Knox froze, but Fisher's hand twitched toward his waistband. Tana's snarl ripped through the air, low and dangerous. When Fisher hesitated, she stepped forward, muscles coiled, eyes locked on him. Ethan could see the recognition in her posture. This was the man she'd fought before. "Hands where I can see them," Ethan ordered. Fisher's lip curled, but he obeyed. In seconds, both men were cuffed, their boots crunching against the snow as they were led toward waiting transport. Back inside, evidence piled up quickly. Ledgers detailing sales, photographs of dogs with coded notes, and, most damning, training schedules that match the dates of multiple K-9 disappearances across state lines. Drugs were found in false bottom crates, the animals used as decoys. Tana stayed near the rescued puppies until they were carried out, her eyes following each one. Rory had been brought from Helen's truck to be checked by a medic, and when he yipped from across the room, Tana's ears swiveled toward him, a subtle reminder of why she had survived this long. Renee passed Ethan a clipboard with a grim smile. "This is enough to bury them, and you wouldn't have found that back room without her." Ethan looked at Tana, who was watching him steadily, her breath misting in the cold. "She's not just a witness," he said quietly. "She's the reason we have them at all." By the time the last van pulled away with the freed dogs, the snow had deepened into the kind that swallows sound. The warehouse stood empty, the echo of boots fading into the night. But the air outside felt different. Less like a hunt, more like the end of one. Ethan glanced down at Tana. She was still alert, but her eyes had changed. They held something he hadn't seen before. Not just wariness, but a flicker of relief. Tonight, she hadn't just survived, she had won. Morning came softly to Oakhaven, the pale light of early spring filtering through the blinds of Ethan's kitchen. Snow still clung to the rooftops, but the edges of the drifts had begun to soften under the sun's patient warmth. For the first time in weeks, Ethan wasn't waking up to the sound of his phone buzzing with alerts, or to a pounding on the door. The warehouse raid had been 3 nights ago, and the town's rhythm was slowly returning. But for Tana, the world had already changed. She lay on the braided rug in front of the fireplace, her head resting on her front paws, eyes half closed. Rory was a small warm ball pressed against her chest, his breathing soft and steady. Ethan stood at the counter pouring coffee, watching the two of them with a faint smile. Wendy was at the table, still in her pajamas, drawing with colored pencils. Every so often, she'd glance toward Tana as if to make sure she was still there. The knock at the door was light, almost tentative. When Ethan opened it, Captain Renee Foster stood there, her uniform neat, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. She stepped inside, removing her gloves. "Thought you'd want to see this," she said, holding out a folded newspaper. The Oakhaven Gazette's front page carried a headline that seemed almost surreal. "From Fugitive to Hero, K-9. Tana helps bring down illegal trafficking ring." Beneath it was a photo taken the night of the raid. Tana sitting beside a row of freed dogs, the snow falling around her, eyes locked on the camera with quiet authority. "They're already running it statewide," Renee added. "By tomorrow it'll be national." Wendy slid off her chair to take the paper, her face lighting up. "They finally know the truth," she said, crouching beside Tana to show her the photo. "You're famous now." Tana blinked slowly, her tail giving a single, calm thump. Later that day, the town held a small ceremony in the community hall. It wasn't official police business, more a gathering of people who wanted to see justice recognized. Helen was there, leaning on her cane, her eyes bright. Agnes McCall stood in the back, arms crossed but smiling faintly. Marilyn, the animal control officer, had brought a tray of homemade cookies because no Oakhaven gathering was complete without them. Renee stepped up to the microphone, her voice carrying easily through the hall. "When we think of heroes, we often think of those in uniform," she began. "But sometimes those heroes walk on 4 legs. Tana was branded dangerous, hunted, and nearly lost forever. But she was never the threat they said she was. She was the one who ended the threat." Ethan stood beside Tana at the front of the hall. Rory sat in Wendy's arms, gnawing on the edge of her sleeve. When Renee turned to them, she held out a small box. Inside was a medal on a simple blue ribbon. "For bravery, loyalty, and service beyond duty," she read before looping the ribbon gently around Tana's neck. Wendy stepped forward then, pulling something from her pocket. It was the braided blue collar she'd made weeks ago from an old length of rope and twine. She fastened it over the medal, the fibers soft against Tana's fur. "This one's from me," Wendy whispered so only Tana could hear. "It means you're free." The hall erupted in applause, not loud or raucous, but warm, the kind that fills a space without needing to shake the walls. That evening, Ethan signed the final papers that made it official. Tana and Rory were his. Wendy and her mother had been spending more and more time at the cabin, and when the subject came up, it seemed natural that they'd simply stay. The cabin felt less like a place for one man and more like a home now. Muddy paw prints by the door, a second pair of boots beside his, and the sound of Wendy's laughter drifting from the porch. Life didn't shift into some perfect fairy tale overnight. There were still moments when Tana would stiffen at the sound of an unfamiliar engine outside, or when Rory would yelp in his sleep, legs twitching from dreams too big for him. But there was safety now, and routine. On mornings when Ethan had early patrol, Tana would ride in the passenger seat of his SUV, her gaze sweeping the streets with quiet vigilance. Rory, still too young for long shifts, stayed home with Wendy, chasing after her, as she did chores, or tried to teach him to sit without much success. Wendy had taken to reading aloud in the evenings, sometimes from library books, sometimes from her own notebook filled with stories she was writing. Tana seemed to listen, her eyes half-lidded but attentive, while Rory sprawled across her paws like a little king. One Sunday, just before dusk, Ethan sat on the porch steps, coffee cooling in his hand. The air was crisp, the last of the snow melting into the earth, and the sound of water trickled somewhere beyond the trees. Tana lay beside him, her body relaxed, but her eyes always scanning the edge of the yard. "You saved more than just dogs that night," Ethan said quietly. "You saved people too. Me, Wendy, yourself." Tana's ears twitched at the sound of her name. She leaned slightly against his leg, the weight of her warm and steady. Wendy appeared in the doorway, Rory tumbling after her. "Dinner's ready," she called. And for a moment the cabin's windows glowed with the kind of light you can't manufacture, the light that comes from people who belong together. A week later, a letter arrived in the mail, addressed simply to K9 Tana, care of Officer Ethan Cole. Inside was a note written in neat handwriting. "We heard about what you did. My partner went missing 3 years ago during a raid. We never found him. Knowing you made it home gives me hope again. Thank you for reminding us that not all endings are losses. It was signed by a retired canine handler from another state. Ethan read it aloud to Wendy, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Then Wendy knelt beside Tana, hugging her neck. See? You're helping people you've never even met. The dog's eyes softened, her breath slow and even. That night, the fire crackled in the hearth, and the scent of wood smoke wrapped around the cabin. Wendy dozed in the armchair, Rory curled in her lap. Tana lay on the rug, her head resting on her paws, the blue collar still fastened proudly around her neck. Outside, the world was still cold, but inside, warmth settled into every corner. The kind that comes from knowing you've faced the worst of the winter and found spring waiting on the other side. Ethan reached down to rest his hand on Tana's back. "Welcome home," he murmured. And for the first time in a long time it felt like they all were.